Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see a lot of faces I know. And can I welcome you to this meeting of the APPG on Britain-Palestine, which today we are looking at apartheid in a post-apartheid world. There's a non-controversial statement, but an interesting statement and an interesting point to be looking at this. We are recording this meeting, so it will be available online afterwards, just for your information. So if you don't want your face on show, please do take your camera off, but it would be very nice if particularly parliamentarians did keep their camera on, because I think it's always better watching something where you can see people. We've got three speakers today. We've got Michael Lynk, who is a former UN Special Rapporteur. We've got Sami Abu Shehadeh, is that how I say your name, Sami? I try my best. Who is a Palestinian citizen and an Israeli member of the Knesset. And we've got Karla McLaren, who is the political relations manager from Amnesty International. So welcome to you all. The format of today's meeting is we're going to hear from the three speakers, and then there will be an opportunity for a Q&A at the end of that. So if you can indicate as we're going through, if you'd like to ask a question in the chat, that would be really helpful. You don't need to put your question in the chat, just say, you know, I'd like to ask a question, and I'll keep a note of it. And then when we come to the end of the contributions, we can get straight into questions. So I'm going to ask Karla to go first, please, and give your contribution. Thanks, Karla.
Thanks, Julie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really honoured to be speaking alongside Michael and Sami. I'm really looking forward to their contributions and the questions that we can have afterwards. I wanted to say at the outset that in Amnesty's report that we published in February of this year, where we for the first time conclude that Israel is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid, we demonstrate that Israel is committing that crime wherever it exercises control. So that's in the occupied Palestinian territories, where obviously that's Michael's remit as Special Rapporteur. In Israel itself, obviously Sami will have a wealth of experience and expertise as a member of the Knesset, and against Palestinian refugees who are denied the right to return. Our report was the first time that we made that conclusion, but obviously we're following many others who have concluded similarly. Many Palestinian organisations, Israeli organisations, Yesh Din and B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, of course, last year, and now the UN Special Rapporteur, Michael Lynk, in his recent report. We, of course, wonder if the UN established commission of inquiry that will report in June for the first time will draw a similar conclusion. And we're urging the International Criminal Court to consider the applicability of the crime in its investigation that's ongoing. Some people find the use of the term apartheid controversial or unhelpful, and we understand at Amnesty that not everyone is going to use the same language as us right now. Amnesty's report was more than 4 years in the making. So others, whether that's civil society organisations, political parties, states, will take their own time. But we do think that it's really important to point out that there is a growing international consensus on this. And while the Israeli government fiercely denies it, many former Israeli politicians have accepted it. As far back as 2002, former Attorney General Michael Lynk said, "We established an apartheid regime in the occupied territories." And I know that he's said similar more recently, and Michael's going to mention that. Also, Minister Yossi Sarid, former Israeli Environment Minister Yossi Sarid, in 2008 said, "What acts like apartheid is run like apartheid, and harasses like apartheid is not a duck, it is apartheid." And that's just a few examples. And for us at Amnesty, you know, as Yossi Sarid has said, we do think it's important to call apartheid apartheid. When you look at the evidence, some of which you'll hear today, the legal basis is clear. The crime of apartheid is being committed in plain sight, as Michael has said, and the international community must ensure that Israel faces consequences as a result of that. When Amnesty says apartheid, we mean the crime against humanity of apartheid as defined in international law. And in the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute, apartheid is defined as systematic oppression and domination with inhumane acts perpetrated in order to maintain that system. So you need to have both of those things. In our report, 280 pages, we document the systematic nature of oppression and domination that Israel imposes, and that's through laws, policies, and practice. We describe massive seizures of Palestinian land and property, unlawful killings, the forcible transfer of Palestinian people from their land, drastic movement restrictions, the denial of nationality and citizenship, and all this amounts to apartheid under international law. I'm sure that Michael and Sami will talk more on some of those things and others. Today, I want to talk a little bit about land rights specifically and how that relates to forced evictions and home demolitions, which is a current priority for us. Palestinian citizens of Israel are effectively blocked from leasing land on 80% of state land. The Negev region is a prime example of this and how Israel's discriminatory planning and building policies are designed to maximize land and resources for Jewish Israelis at the expense of Palestinian citizens. In the Negev, instead of zoning Palestinian Bedouin villages as residential areas, since the 70s, the authorities have zoned the villages and the lands around them for military, industrial, or public use. So residents of unrecognized villages are considered to be illegal squatters. They're unable to apply for building permits because the land is not designated as residential. As a consequence, the buildings of whole communities have been repeatedly demolished. By contrast, Israeli courts have retroactively approved Jewish communities built without building permits, and that's in the same area as well. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians comprise 60% of the population, but only 15% of the land is designated for Palestinian residents. According to Peace Now, between 1991 and 2018, only 16% of applications for building permits approved in Jerusalem were for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. 38% were for Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem, and the rest were for West Jerusalem. In Area C of the West Bank, Palestinians are only allowed to build on estimated 0.5% of the land, and most of that is already built up. Meanwhile, 70% of the land in Area C is allocated to settlements. In July 2019, the Security Council, the Israeli Security Council cabinet promised to grant building permits for more than 700 Palestinian building and housing units. By contrast, it promised building permits for 6,000 housing units for Jewish settlers. But by the end of 2020, only one building permit had been issued for Palestinians, and by contrast, more than 1,000 had been issued for Jewish settlements. So those statistics are obviously staggering, but behind those statistics is the devastating reality for Palestinians who cannot get building permits, are forced to build houses without authorization, and then their houses are demolished, sometimes repeatedly. There's a quote in our report from Sami Abu Shehadeh, who is a resident of the West Bank, who I just wanted to share with you. He said, "My kids are always scared. We are always scared. When the army comes in and your children are terrorized and crying and outside in the pouring rain, I promise you, there is no human being on earth that is meant to be able to handle that. The only way to describe it is as a tragedy. I ask anyone with a conscience to pressure the Israelis to do one thing, to stop the demolitions and to allow us to live our life. We're not asking for much." I will end there because I think I've run over a little bit, but I just wanted to quickly say that we are, at Amnesty, we're urging all parliamentarians to speak in Parliament about the systematic discrimination that Palestinians face, and really press the UK government to hold Israel to account. And that needs to be more than just statements. There needs to be concrete consequences for Israel, and a straightforward first step on that would be to ban the import of settlement goods, which obviously finance and legitimize illegal settlements, and also to support international justice processes such as the Commission of Inquiry and the ICC investigation.
Thanks very much, Karla, for setting the scene really of what the reality of what is going on at the moment in the Palestinian occupied territories is quite frightening. We'll move to Michael next. Michael Lynk, it's lovely to have you join us today, Michael. If you'd like to give us your contribution, thank you.
Thank you for that, Julie. And thank you for the invitation to join this webinar today and to speak about my latest, as it turns out, my last report as Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territory. The dedicated theme of my report addresses the question of whether Israel's acquisitive and repressive practices over the course of its 55-year-old occupation has curdled from an endless occupation into something darker, harsher, and more ominous. In recent months, distinguished voices have concluded that the inexorable facts of Israel's occupation, the relentless land confiscation, the ever-expanding Jewish-only settlements, the dual legal system, the vast gap in living conditions between Israeli settlers and Palestinians living among them, torture, home demolitions, collective punishment, the depleted Palestinian economy, whether all of this amounts to or resembles apartheid. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon wrote in 2021, and I'm quoting, that Israel's structural domination and oppression of the Palestinian people through indefinite occupation arguably constitutes apartheid. Nobel laureate Desmond Tutu wrote in 2014, and again I'm quoting, I know firsthand that Israel has created an apartheid reality within its borders and through its occupation. And the former Attorney General of Israel, Michael Ben-Yair, wrote last month that Israel's ongoing domination over the Palestinian territories is a gross injustice which must be urgently rectified. It is with great sadness that I must also conclude that my country has sunk to such political and moral depths that it is now an apartheid regime. It is time for the international community to recognize this as well. And he continued, you can simply not be a liberal democracy if you operate apartheid over another people. It's a contradiction in terms because Israel's entire society is complicit in this unjust reality, unquote. So my report asks, has this 55-year-old occupation transformed itself into apartheid? Applying the accepted three-part test taken from the 1973 UN Convention Against Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, I concluded in my report that the political system of entrenched rule in the occupied Palestinian territory satisfies this prevailing test with respect to the existence of apartheid in the OPT. First, an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination has been established. Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs in East Jerusalem and the West Bank live their lives under a single regime which differentiates in its distribution of rights and benefits based on national and ethnic identity, and which ensures the supremacy of one group over another, and to the detriment of the other. The differences in living conditions and citizenship rights and benefits are stark, deeply discriminatory, and maintained through systematic and institutionalized oppression. The second part of the test is this: the system of alien rule has been established with the intention to maintain the domination of one national racial ethnic group over another. Israeli political leaders, past and present, have repeatedly stated that they intend to retain control over all of the occupied territory in order to enlarge the blocks of land for present and future Jewish settlements, while confining the Palestinians to barricaded population reserves. Under this particular system, the freedoms of one group are inexorably bound up in the subjugation of the other. And the third part of the apartheid test is the imposition of the system of institutionalized discrimination, through the regular practice of what international law calls inhumane acts, arbitrary and extrajudicial killings, torture, the violent deaths of children, the denial of fundamental human rights, a fundamentally flawed military court system, and the lack of criminal due process, arbitrary detention, collective punishment, the desperate living conditions in barricaded Gaza. The repetition of these acts over long periods of time and their endorsement by the Knesset and the Israeli judicial system indicates that these are not part of random and isolated acts, but they're integral to Israel's system of rule. This is apartheid. It doesn't have some of the same features that were practiced in Southern Africa before the 1990s. In particular, much of what has been called petite apartheid in Southern Africa, the separate water coolers, the separate benches, the segregated beaches, are not present. On the other hand, there are pitiless features of Israel's apartness rule in the Occupied Palestinian Territory that were not practiced in Southern Africa, such as segregated highways, high walls and extensive checkpoints, a barricaded population, missile strikes and tank shelling of a civilian population, and the abandonment of the Palestinian social welfare to the international community. With the eyes of the international community wide open, Israel has imposed upon Palestine an apartheid reality in a post-apartheid world. As I conclude, I want to address one of the most important and neglected issues dealing with the the Israeli occupation of Palestine, which is the remarkable unwillingness of the international community to impose any accountability measures on Israel for its forever occupation, which has been conducted both in absolute defiance of international law and with the eyes of the international community wide open. The UN Security Council has adopted over 30 resolutions over the past 5 decades critical of Israel and its occupation. The General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have adopted hundreds more resolutions. According to the well-established consensus in international law, the Israeli settlements are illegal, annexation is illegal, the denial of Palestinian self-determination is illegal, human rights abuses are rife, the Fourth Geneva Convention is supposed to apply in full. None of these countless resolutions have been obeyed by Israel, and nothing has been imposed upon Israel to bring it into compliance with a rules-based international order. When the international community allows a member state permission to go rogue, it is going rogue itself. I wouldn't be here in front of you today speaking about my latest report on how an unrelenting occupation has metastasized into apartheid if the international community had taken its own laws seriously 40 or 45 years ago, when the Security Council and the General Assembly began to adopt the first of their many resolutions critical of the Israeli occupation. International law is not meant to be an umbrella that folds up at the first sign of rain. Had the international community accompanied these resolutions with resolute accountability and consistency decades ago, in the same way that it's doing today with great urgency respecting the invasion and occupation of Ukraine, then we would likely already have had a just and durable resolution to the question of Palestine, and no one will be talking about apartheid today. In closing, I want to echo the words of Albert Camus, who once wrote that calling things by their wrong name adds to the affliction of the world. It is important that we recognize that this occupation has become indistinguishable from apartheid, but it's even more important that we insist that the international community, particularly North America and Europe, impose the necessary accountability measures to end the occupation and the practices of apartheid and enable the realization of Palestinian self-determination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for that very, very moving report, actually, of the situation that Palestinian people are experiencing. Our final speaker today is Sami. If you'd like to give us your contribution now, and then we'll move to questions. And again, can I ask people just to indicate in the chat if they want to ask a question? Sami, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much for also the speakers before me that made a lot of the work. First of all, I would really like to thank you for inviting me to this very important webinar, and I think it's gaining more and more importance with in the last 2 years, 5 different important reports are echoing what we have as Palestinians been saying for a lot of time, that the Israeli state is becoming an apartheid state. We think that it was established like this, but at least in the last 2 years, with these 5 very important reports coming out from an Israeli human rights NGO, B'Tselem, and then the Human Rights Watch report, and then the very important Amnesty's report that we are discussing now, and also a very important report from the Harvard Law School, and lately the very important work of Michael for the UN. All these important reports are saying the same thing. Israel is applying an apartheid system, by the way, in both sides of the green line, not just in the occupied Palestinian territories, but also within the state and within, as if the state borders, because Israel till now do not have a clear border, but also when we are talking about how does the state of Israel deals with its own Palestinian citizens, 20% of the population. And all these very important 5 reports have a lot of details and a lot of definitions and a lot of criteria and a lot of discussion. But to be honest, in the case of Israel, you don't need all these reports. If any stranger would come and just drive his car in the state of Israel from one place to the other, you would see racism and discrimination wherever you go. And there is one line that brings all this racist thing that you are going to see while you are driving in the state of Israel, that whenever you are doing the comparison between the Jewish area and the Arab Palestinian area beside it, you would see that the system is in favoring all the time Jewish supremacy. You don't need to have a PhD in law in order to see the Israeli apartheid. You simply just drive your car in this state, which is having 5 different legal systems. Israel, which is controlling all of historical Palestine, mandatory Palestine, which is geographically a very small state. The state of Israel is controlling all over historical Palestine, and it's implying 5 different legal systems for different groups. We have one legal system for the Palestinians in Gaza, nearly 2 million people in the biggest prison in the world. Israel is putting them under siege for a very, very long time, and they have their own legal system. Then you have another legal system for the West Bank, for the Palestinians in the West Bank. Different legal system. They have a lot of checkpoints, walls, different ways to destroy their daily life, but it's different than the situation in Gaza. Then you have another legal system, which is different for the Palestinians who are living in East Jerusalem. These people are called residents. They don't have Israeli citizenship. They are dealt totally different, and they have their own legal system. Then you have another legal system for the Palestinians that I'm representing, the Palestinian people who are 20% of the population living as Israeli citizens. The indigenous community, the indigenous people that were living before establishing the state of Israel. Now we are 1.7 million people, 20% of the population. We have another legal system that Israel is running. But then for the Jews who are spread all over historical Palestine, they have their own legal system that keeps Jewish supremacy wherever you go. Also, if you are a settler in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem, also if you are living in Tel Aviv, as a Jew, you have your own legal system that keeps Jewish supremacy all over the area which was once mandatory Palestine. So Israel, if you choose any definition of apartheid, sits very good in any definition, not just what was used in Amnesty's reports and all the reports. In any definition of apartheid, Israel sits great in these definitions. The political question usually, what can we do in such a case? And mainly when we are talking to British audience, I think First of all, the British state cannot continue ignoring the responsibility for the Palestinian situation. At least they cannot continue celebrating the Balfour Declaration. This is something which is unbelievable in nowadays, after seeing all the results of what happened from the British Balfour Declaration for the destruction of the Palestinian people and the continuous celebrations of annual celebrations of the British government for the Balfour Declaration. At least they can stop this. And then they can also stop dealing with Israel as a normal state. Stop dealing with Israel as a state which is above international law. And they can do a lot of different steps. First of all, they should stop preventing us, the Palestinians, from struggling for justice and equality. We are not allowed, from their point of view, to continue our struggle. We cannot go in. The reaction to the Amnesty's report was a really very strange reaction. They said that only the court can decide if Israel is applying an apartheid. But in the same time, we are not allowed as Palestinians to take Israel to ICC to have this decision, which is could be clearly proven. They also should stop, and they talk all the time against the settlements, but they are financing part of the settlers' activity. And they are against labeling the products from the settlements, which is again supporting the settlers. So at least they should help us in continuing our struggle for justice and equality. All the time we are having very good statements here and there, but at the end, when things come to a development that can help the Palestinians, we see that nothing happens. The Jewish state that was established on the ruins of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian state has become a very racist entity. And you are seeing racism all over that is affecting the Palestinian lives all over the world, not just those who are living inside historical Palestine or mandatory Palestine. In the Balad party, my party, we are bringing a totally different solution for the whole issue. We believe in the two-state solution. A Palestinian state living beside the state that we call it the state of all its citizens. We see that Jewish democracy is an oxymoron. This continuous support for a Jewish democracy, probably the politicians who are supporting this did not think much about it, or they don't know about our existence. 20% of the population inside Israel, we are not Jews. Keeping Jewish supremacy means that we cannot ever become equal citizens in the state. For this, we have developed a different political solution. It's very easy. We just want to change Israel into a normal democracy. We call it the state of all its citizens. Our solution is based on human rights, on justice and equality for all. We acknowledge the self-determination right for the Jewish community that are living in historical Palestine. And we believe in all the rights. We just need them to acknowledge our identity as a national minority, as Palestinians, which they are still refusing to acknowledge it till today. And we want to develop with them a normal democracy. We call it the state of all its citizens. There is nothing new or too brilliant about this. We just want to have a normal democracy which is not established on race or on ethnic identity. We want it to be established on citizenship, like all normal democracies. Because we have this political solution, we are accused inside the state of Israel of being the most extreme party in the state of Israel, because we fight for peace, justice, and equality for all. Whether you are a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, an atheist, an Arab, all the citizens should be dealt in an equal way and take their rights because they are citizens, not because they were born to this race or to that race. I'm seeing that I'm taking too much time. I will stop here and we'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much for this chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sami. That was a very clear exposition of your position. Thanks very much. So we'll go to questions now. I'd like to ask Michael, you talked about the international community taking action. What measures do you think would be effective? And then I'm going to bring in Debbie Abrahams and Andy Dare next. Michael.
Sure, thank you for that question. The issues that would raise probably the most effective accountability measures with respect to Israel would be Western states in particular, who would do, I'm going to suggest three things. One would be to stop the arms trade and relationship with Israel as long as it remains a belligerent occupier. Two, that Western countries should review and if necessary end their free trade agreements with Israel. And three, at a very minimum, there should be the prohibition, the absolute prohibition of goods and services produced by the illegal Israeli settlements coming into the UK and European and international marketplace. Those are the things I think should be on the list of any country that's serious about wanting to preserve the space for a two-state solution and ending the occupation consistent with international law.
Thank you, Michael. Very clear. So I'm going to bring Debbie Abrahams and then Andy Dare in next. Debbie.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you so much, everyone, for your presentations. My question was actually yours, Julie, but let's build on that in terms of also in terms of what the institutions, the international institutions such as the UN, what could our international institutions do? Your report, Michael, what do you think is going to happen to that?
Well, I hope my report winds up getting read along with the volume of other reports that have come out, particularly over the past 2 years. What I'm hoping, among other things, besides what I've just mentioned in terms of accountability measures, I would hope that that Western countries in particular would wind up supporting the ongoing investigation at the International Criminal Court, that being led by the prosecutor. Obviously, you know, he comes from, he's a British prosecutor, Karim Khan. I would hope that if there is a resolution, and there's talk of it now, the possibility of an advisory opinion being sought by the UN General Assembly to the International Court of Justice to ask whether Israel's occupation has now become illegal under international law. I would hope there would wind up being support for that. I would hope that there'd be support for the Commission of Inquiry that was established by the UN Human Rights Council last summer, and which was appointed over the summer and is now deeply engaged in its work, and we're expecting its first report in June. It's been, I guess, mandated with the task of looking at the root causes with respect to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. That's a fairly broad remit. It goes beyond my own mandate with respect to the Occupied Palestinian Territory and looks at issues going back before 1967 and issues that go on between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. So I would hope for all of those initiatives that are going on within the UN system or related to it, that there would be support by the West for this. You know, unless Israel feels there's going to be a cost, and a significant cost, for the continuation of its occupation and the continuation of its defiance of international law, you know, then it's going to be a fairy tale to believe that we're going to expect any change in behavior with respect to this.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Andy Dare next.
I would like to sort of take on the same subject. I think a lot of us listening to this have heard things about the case for apartheid, which we don't really need persuading about, but I think what we're all looking for is what we can actually do in practical terms. And my particular question is that last year, both Labour and Liberal Democrats passed resolutions to ban trade from settlements. And then I think it was just after the May Troubles, there was an emergency debate in Parliament when even Conservative MPs were critical of what Israel was doing. And so it seems to, I mean, as somebody who's not in Parliament, it just surprises me that we've got so many members of our Parliament who would like to do that ban, my question is, why on earth can they not get together and shame the Conservative Party into doing it? Because we all heard, well, those of us who listened to the debate heard James cleverly continually mouthing words like we do sort of mention occasionally to the Israelis that they're not quite pucker, but they don't really want to actually do anything. And my question really is to any of the parliamentarians, do we lack somebody amongst us who's got the charisma and the power to take hold of this and win Parliament over? Because there must be Conservatives who would go along with this. We're all asking for a ban on that trade, and we all know it's illegal under international law to continue doing it. It just seems frustrating that it's not happening. I better stop because I'm rabbiting.
No, it's fine, Andy. I will, even though I'm not on the panel, I'll chip in on that one, and then I'm going to ask Karla to comment, because Karla deals with parliamentarians from all parties on a regular basis. I think there's 2 or 3 things to say. Firstly, COVID's had a massive impact on the work that we do in Parliament. We had a general election, December 2019, literally weeks later, we were in lockdown. We're just really getting to know our new colleagues from all sides, because we've only really been back in Parliament properly a few months. And this issue is not necessarily the burning issue for everybody in Parliament. It's one of those things, you build relationships, you talk to people, you find out where they are, you move along with the conversation. So I think that's one thing to say. And the other thing to say is, although many of us speak out on this at every opportunity we get, it is by no means, it is everybody on this call's view, I think, but it is by no means the majority view in Parliament. I think it's fair to say this is not just a Labour, Liberal, Green position against the Conservatives. There are Conservatives who agree with us. I'm not sure there's any on the call today, but there are. And there are people in our own parties who disagree with us. So it doesn't totally split down party political lines. That's the very nature of this group. We are an all-party group. So it is much more complex, but I do think the biggest issue at the minute for us is that we just haven't had time to build those relationships with the newer MPs, and there was a massive churn of members of Parliament at the last general election. Karla, I don't know whether from an outsider who deals with people, MPs from all parties, what your take on this is.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what has been said already. There is definitely cross-party support and cross-party opposition. What I would say, I really agree with Andy on, and obviously I talked about this in my contributions, and Michael and Sami both said it as well. The prohibition on importing settlement goods, we've been talking about it for years, and obviously, many others have as well, Palestinian organizations for a lot longer, but you don't have to agree with the use of the term apartheid or agree with the fact that it is apartheid taking place to see that goods from settlements which are completely illegal under international law, which everybody accepts, should not be being traded in the UK. And I do think that there is a chink of possibility for that. The UK government is currently negotiating a free trade agreement with Israel. I think it's possible that they will agree that the territorial applicability of that will only be Israel itself, but it needs to be much stronger than that. The government keeps saying, well, settlement goods are exempt from trade preferences, but that doesn't go far enough. And even labelling doesn't go far enough. We shouldn't be having goods imported in here that are illegal by definition. And I think that the Lib Dem and Labour conference resolutions of last year were helpful, and I've seen a clear statement in response from Layla Moran last autumn in response, committing to that policy position for the Lib Dems, which is great. I don't think that Labour are quite there yet, but I do think that, again, there's space with the current front bench that policy to be taken forward. And I think that is a really clear action that Labour parliamentarians on the call could take forward internally within the party to get that commitment within the party, that will be a clear public policy position. And that goes for SNP as well. I don't know if there's any SNP parliamentarians on the line, but that's something that we're talking to the SNP about as well. So it's definitely a cross-party issue, and I do think that's something very clear that parliamentarians can get behind. And then the support for UN and international accountability mechanisms is something that I think there is, we've had clear support from Labour on that in the last few weeks, which has been really, really helpful. And I think that's again something that all parties and all parliamentarians should be really pressing the government on, because as Sami said, the government's response to whether it agrees with the determination that the crime of apartheid is being committed is kind of nonsensical. Like the last one that came out was that they don't agree with it's for judicial bodies to make that decision. But then if you push them on their support for the ICC, they say we support the impartiality of the ICC, but we don't think that the ICC applies in this case, even though the ICC itself has determined its applicability. So how can you support its impartiality and then not agree with the judicial decision that it's come to? So I think that again is a really clear inconsistency that really needs to be pressed on at every opportunity.
Thank you, Karla. I'm going to bring in Andy Mcdonald next. Andy.
Can I say just a few remarks?
Oh yes, of course, Sami, of course. Sorry.
Thank you. I think one of our challenges is that there is also some misconceptions or misinformations regarding the Israeli state, which generally in the West it still has a democratic image. I know that a lot of British parliamentarians and European parliamentarians do come to do tours to see Israel. And usually these tours are planned by the Israeli Knesset or different Israeli Zionist NGOs. What I think would be very helpful is that if these people are doing the efforts to come and really see, to learn, to know more, that they should at least give a day or two in their program to see what's happening on the land from Palestinian eyes. It's important if they are visiting inside the Green Line to go and see what does it mean to live as a Bedouin citizen in the unrecognized villages where we have something like 100,000 people who are Israeli citizens who don't have the basic infrastructure that includes water supplies or normal electricity supplies, or where they have daily house demolitions, or to visit people who are living nearby this racist wall, and just to give, if they are doing the effort, is just to try to see the whole picture, not just what Zionist organizations want them to see while they are having a drink in a bar in Tel Aviv or so. So if these people are doing, parliamentarians or any people who are doing tours, just to see also the Palestinian side of the story, this is something very important. Another thing that we all can do, which is also very important, I think part of this false image of Israel as a democracy is people don't know the basics, whether we are seeing this as serious or not, but not everybody knows also the basics. So these 5 important reports could be summarized into something that we can be sure that a parliamentarian will give enough time to read, and to bring them just the summary of the 5 reports, put that on their table. This can also, for all, not just for the British parliamentarians, for all the parliamentarians in Europe, just to let them know the simple fact that in the last 2 years, there are 5 important reports that sees Israel as implying apartheid on the Palestinians. So this is another small step that we can do, at least to bring more awareness to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sami. And I have to say, when I visited in 2017, seeing things for yourself really does make it hit home what you've read about. There's no substitute for actually going and visiting the different areas and seeing the reality on the ground. It's an unforgettable and actually quite traumatic, I think, experience. Andy, do you want to come in now?
Thanks, Julie. I'd wholeheartedly agree with that comment. When a lot of parliamentarians do go to Palestine, and I'm grateful to Joe and colleagues at CABU for the work that they do, and I benefit from that visit, and so for myself, amongst other things, a sewerage pipe being led from a settlement at the top of the hill down into the Palestinian school and vented in the kindergarten playground. I thought it's the nastiness of how thinking that sort of oppression through. But I just wanted to come in on this issue of the UK Parliament, because Julie's right. There are a great many sympathetic and supportive MPs across the House. They're not just restricted to the opposition benches. There are a number of Conservative MPs who are supportive, but unfortunately, every time we promote these debates, I'm afraid we lose on sheer numbers. We did have the benefit of somebody I regard as a decent minister in Alistair Burt in the last Parliament, a very thoughtful individual, but we never got over the issue of recognizing Palestine. And I'm afraid to inform the non-parliamentarians here that I sense that it's actually swung away from us. We just had the Public Services Pension Bill that made it illegal for our local authorities to decide not to invest their pension funds in settlement companies. That has been resisted, and we have been defeated in that respect. I don't know how on earth it could possibly be policed, but that gives you a tenor of the mood of this current Parliament. But I think this meeting has been enormously helpful, and the contributions from each and every one of those speakers has been terribly informative to me and I know to other colleagues. And we need to not only read Michael's report, but perhaps have the benefit of further input from Karla and from Sami. And on the latter, I thought Sami's lifting the veil, as it were, on Israel itself, needing to be a state for all its citizens is hugely important. But the other issue that we continue to wrestle with is when we ever get into discussion about what's happening in the West Bank or in Gaza, or indeed, as Sami's pointed out, in Israel itself, we have to navigate around the issue of anti-Semitism. And we seem to have split that now. We seem to successfully have got that into a position where this is wholeheartedly wrong to engage in that behavior. But that does not prevent us from having a dialogue about how Israel is behaving. And that's a big issue for us. I hope that we're in a more intelligent space about it. But in response to Andy, I'd just like to say that, Andy, we are desperately trying to seize every single opportunity to raise this. Parliament is about to be prorogued tomorrow, but when we come back after the Queen's speech, I'm convinced that there will be more opportunities for us to do this, but armed with some of those arguments that have been so expertly outlined for us today. And I'm just want to express my thanks, Julie, for those contributions, because I thought they're absolutely superb. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I think they were more comments than a question, which is just as valuable. But thank you very much. And I would agree, we at the last election lost some very influential colleagues on the government benches, particularly on this issue, which is a huge miss. Charlotte Marshall's indicated she'd like to ask a question, and then I'll bring Debbie Abrahams back in. Charlotte.
Thank you. I was really interested to hear, particularly from you, Michael, about your sort of thoughts on the next steps in terms of now you've had this report out there. And as civil society organisations, we were certainly thrilled in 2017 when Virginia Tilley and Richard Falk issued their report on apartheid, but that was very much disregarded at the higher levels of the United Nations. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on how has this report been received at the Secretariat? How do you see how the UN can help endorse that report and make it a valuable tool for those of us in civil society to use?
Sure. Thanks very much, Charlotte, for that question. You referred to the 2017 report by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley. That was commissioned by a UN agency based in Beirut, known as ECOSOC. And that report, I think, lasted 48 hours on the UN website. And what was revealed afterwards was that the American ambassador to the United Nations at that time, Nikki Haley, had telephoned the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and said to him that, you know, we're going to blow our stack if you keep this report saying that there was apartheid in Israel and the OPT on the UN websites, and it was taken down. My report, I mean, if we measure success by increments, my report is still standing. I have no expectation that it will be removed or disavowed. I belong to a different body within the UN system, a UN Special Procedures, where independent voluntary experts like myself are appointed to be able to examine particular human rights issues around the world and to make our own comments, our own recommendations, and issue our own reports with respect to this. So the fact that my report now stands as part of the UN system, albeit the view of one special rapporteur, but I have to say, you know, almost 2 years ago, in June 2020, when it appeared that Israel was given the green light by the United States to go ahead and annex significant swaths of the West Bank, I, along with I think 66 other special rapporteurs and independent human rights experts in the UN system, issued a statement condemning the move towards de jure annexation, and we said, if this, you know, this has all the attributes of 21st century apartheid. So, you know, the word is getting to be more and more used. It doesn't have the same shock sticker value that it would have had even 4 or 5 years ago. And I should say, just personally, when I became Special Rapporteur 6 years ago, I said to myself, I'm not going to address the question of apartheid. It's too divisive, it's too inflammatory, and I have other ways of trying to persuade diplomatic and political decision makers. It didn't happen. I worked within most of my initial reports were well within the range of human rights law and international humanitarian law, and it didn't move the needle all that much with respect to the key decision makers in Europe and North America. That, plus the fact that I kept on saying this is a permanent occupation, these are entrenched systems of supremacy, and then I said to myself, but that equals apartheid. How can I not then address the question of apartheid? And so I have, and you see the results with respect to this. But that's, I guess, to me, you know, it's important that we name what it is, which is apartheid. But it's more, even just as important, if not more important, that we insist upon that other big A word, accountability. Because without accountability, there never will be an end to the occupation and the realization of Palestinian self-determination.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think the mood has moved as to, yes, I think a few years ago, the idea of calling it apartheid, even though when you look at it, there isn't any other way to describe it really, was just not a possibility. But now I think, you know, the number of reports, and I think Amnesty, your report, really moved the bar on this, because Amnesty is such a worldwide recognized, respected organization. And I know it's uncomfortable, and I know a lot of people who support the cause of the Palestinian people, even now, still find it uncomfortable. But I think it has to be said, and I think it has moved the debate on a little bit. It's just my own personal view, but I think it has been very, very useful. Debbie, I think you wanted to come in on a couple of things, and then we'll have to wrap up. Thanks.
I think, Charlotte, your question was really just showed the precariousness that we face internationally in terms of our political systems, and those leaders and governments, regimes, whatever you'd like to call them, where the rules-based system is being put under pressure and under threat, including our own. And so by trying to use what how we've worked previously, I think we need to be a bit more creative in terms of how we address some of the problems, because having a rational approach, as many colleagues have suggested, I don't think will work. Charlotte, your point was during the Trump regime, where he decided that wasn't, he didn't care that there was injustice in OPT. He just didn't care. So they put pressure on them, and we're seeing it right across the world. Our Prime Minister has gone to India, where there are appalling atrocities occurring across India, but also in Kashmir. And there's even less cross-party support for the issues with Kashmir. So is there something to say in terms of the fact that we need to look for like-minded international colleagues, parliamentarians who do support the rules-based system, that recognise that after the Second World War this was an improvement to the previous decades, and that we need to build that coalition and get that support from a bottom up. But by just sticking to our own parliament isn't going to be enough. We won't get the support. People will say the right things and say that to their constituency, especially in the Red Wall, but they will not do anything about it practically. And I'm sorry to be so harsh.
No, thanks, Debbie. And we actually, one of the things I'm involved in is actually a European network on this very issue, which I'll send you some details of, that we have meetings about every 6 to 8 weeks, where we discuss how we can join together and do letters and do various things across Europe. And I don't mean within the EU, I mean wider Europe.
Yeah, absolutely, across North America and
I'll send you some information on that. I'm just going to wrap up and ask any of the speakers if they'd like to say any closing remarks. This is your opportunity. Maybe Sami first.
Okay, first of all, thank you again for this very important discussion. I think that the issue here is very simple. There are daily crimes happening to the Palestinian people and for humanity by the Israeli occupation and by the Israeli racist supremacy system. When there is a crime and there is no punishment, this is giving green line for the next crime. Nothing will change unless there is some accountability. If Israel will not pay a price for all these crimes against the humanity and against basic human rights for the Palestinian people, things are going to continue, and we may also see things that go worse, because unfortunately in the last 2 decades the Israeli state and society have deteriorated to the very extreme right-wing fascist politics. So in order to stop them, they must pay for their crimes. Otherwise, it's continuing giving them a green line for the next crime. So I think we all should have in our minds how to do that. A lot of steps were mentioned. I think a very important thing that can happen, which also helped a lot in struggling against the apartheid in South Africa, was cultural actions and cultural activities and artists that would support our struggle for ending also the apartheid in this part of the world. This could be also very important, and will have a lot of pressure on politicians in their own states of these artists, and also on the Israeli state. Maybe in the future we can discuss this in a deeper way. Thank you very much for this chance again.
Thanks, Sami. Karla, and then Michael, if there's anything you'd like to say.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Just quickly building on what Sami just said, really, and linking to what Debbie was saying about the international rules-based system. The continued breaches of international law by Israel without any consequence is not, I mean, obviously, as Sami said, it's just going to, those breaches will continue. But that also is a massive attack on the rules-based system itself. And that's, as Michael has referred to. And I think that's an important angle to talk about. That's an angle that parliamentarians can talk about. That's an angle that the Conservative government obviously like to describe themselves as upholders of the rule of law. So I think that's an important one. And then also just to say, in terms of what parliamentarians can do, I think that sort of normalizing this language and moving the debate forward is a really important one. We are seeing that growing consensus internationally. It's not yet reflected in Parliament, and I understand completely why. It can be difficult, and it's possible parliamentarians will get a lot of opposition for it. But I think that the more that parliamentarians can talk about systematic discrimination and call it for what it is, that moves the debate on. And I think that would be incredibly helpful. And Amnesty has a toolkit for parliamentarians that we've shared previously and that we can share again, which should give parliamentarians the language to use to feel confident in doing that.
Thanks, Karla, and that toolkit was very useful. Michael.
And I'll thank you for this, and I'll be very brief. When we talk about apartheid, you may get diverted by the fact that some people say, well, there are things in South Africa that were present during apartheid there that aren't present in Israel and the Occupied Palestinian Territory or in the OPT alone. That's not the comparison point. The starting point for our analysis is what international law says is apartheid. And it's the three-part test that I mentioned in my presentation, that Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and all of the other organizations that have issued these invaluable reports over the last several years have used. That's our starting point. And don't let others try to knock you off that ground zero for understanding what is apartheid and how we come to this. Because at the end of the day, the use of the term apartheid is not meant as an insult or a slur. It's meant as an analytical tool to help us understand whether or not that term properly applies to any given situation, whether it's in the OPT, Southern Africa, or elsewhere in the world today or in the future.
I can't agree with you more, Michael. I think my response when people have said that to me when I've used the term is, I would say nobody doubts that an apartheid system was operating in South Africa. It isn't the same in the occupied territories, but it doesn't mean that it's not apartheid. And I think that is a really, really good point to end on. Can I thank the three speakers very much for giving your time today. It's invaluable to us as parliamentarians to really hear different perspectives on this for people who've spent a lot of time looking at the issue, and for Sami living the issue, and for the others on the call as well for joining us today. And can I just end by saying that, colleagues from Parliament, at any point you get the opportunity to raise this with ministers, please do. We've heard lots of things today that we can raise, because it's only by keeping up the government that we raise it up the political agenda and hopefully get some action eventually on their stance and their movement on this. So thank you everyone for joining today. It's been a fascinating discussion as ever, and I really appreciate everyone's time. Bye. Bye.